Next up, the VHX Strikes Back. The VHX Strikes Back is... Now, earlier I talked about Comics in Motion, where they would break down comic book-based media. Well, this is a spin-off podcast that Dave and Chris created, where they break down movies from the VHS era, back before streaming and DVDs. All the stuff from like my childhood and before, and I just really enjoy going back. And I've actually been a guest on there as well. I went on there to break down Conan the Barbarian, way back, I think like 3 or 4 years ago. But this is a fantastic podcast if you like. I mean, you can see that the movies that they've broken down here. Look at this: Home Alone, Blues Brothers, Dirty Dancing. They even go for obscure stuff like Ninja, Mallrats, Tombstone, American Pie, Highlander, Scream, Rocky IV. I mean, oh my God, Beverly Hills Cop. If you are a fan of film, you'll enjoy the VHS Strikes Back. One of my favorites. Next up, this is Tulsi Gabbard. One episode, just a trailer. She hasn't really put anything out yet, but I tell you what, Tulsi's one of my favorite people that was in Washington. She's one of my favorite people to listen to talk, that has been in the public realm. People have worked in government. And I really appreciate her insight, and I appreciate that she's not far left. She's not far right. She's just a very common sense human being. And so I subscribe to Tulsi, and I eagerly await her putting out some episodes. I really do. Okay, next up, Time Suck with Dan Cummins. I just discovered last year, another one of my favorite podcasts of all time. He dives into everything from cults and serial killers, to, look at this, QAnon and Antifa, Anonymous, El Chapo. It's a lot of history mixed with a lot of true crime. It's really good. He deep dives on each of these podcasts, as you can see. And some of them are motivational. Some of them are cool, like Annie Oakley. That's kind of like more of a historical podcast. Then you've got stuff like the Nexium cult, Hollow Earth theory, Alexander the Great, like the American riots, the 1992 LA riots, the Titanic, Vampire of Sacramento, strange kidnapping of Patty Hearst. I mean, he goes deep on all these subjects. It's such a good time, and he's hilarious. This is another podcast that has a huge cult following, and another one that I'm proud to be a part of. All right, we're getting down here. We're getting down to the last few. What Say You is a podcast that they put one out in 2020, but before that, they hadn't put one out since 17, and before that, since 16. But for the few years before their little hiatus, this was such a fantastic podcast. Another cult-inducing podcast. Sal Vulcano and Brian Quinn, the two guys from Impractical Jokers, Sal and Q, they decided to sit down together and do this podcast, and it's so random. Some of the stories they tell, some of the things they decide to do are some of my favorite things I've ever heard. And I've listened to most of these episodes twice, just because I there's no more new episodes to listen to. So I've just listened to them over and over again. But that's how good it is. It's really fantastic. These guys are hilarious. And they go into some weird stuff and some funny stories. But if I'm just a big fan of Impractical Jokers, and I'm a big fan of these guys in particular. And so I had to check it out. And once I did, I binged it. And then, like I said, there were no new episodes, so I went back and listened to them all again. But it's a fantastic podcast. So damn good. Next up, we got Wrongful Conviction podcast. Now, this is probably the most important podcast that I listen to. These guys, these two lawyers, actually, I'm not sure that they're lawyers. These guys, they're activists, right? And they go through and examine cases where people have been wrongfully convicted, wrongfully imprisoned, sometimes even wrongfully put to death. But their entire mission is freeing people using, new technology that could show DNA tests or things like that. Things that, or bringing about inconsistencies in cases and getting people who should not be in prison out of prison. But it's probably the most important podcast on my list in terms of what it does in the world. But really interesting stories, kind of heart-wrenching stories sometimes of people who are wrongfully convicted and put in prison for years and years. But yeah, I highly recommend this podcast. Really interesting and really important. Next up, we've got XMen Unraveled. This is a new podcast. This is one I just started listening to, and someone that I am bringing on my Marvel Plus podcast next month to talk about Loki. But this girl, Noelle Reed, had a fantastic idea. She goes through all the X-Men comics, but she doesn't do it in order like from number 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. She goes through chronologically, so with all the crazy retcons and things that have changed over the years, all the things that have been inserted, like, oh, this is the new history. She goes back and does it chronologically. So she talks about the earliest X-Men who were alive. So she starts out talking about like Apocalypse, right? And then Mr. Sinister, and then Wolverine, because these were the ones that have been alive the longest. And she goes through the stories chronologically. I thought it was a fantastic idea, and so far I've loved the podcast. And I wait. I think she puts one out every 2 weeks. So far, I'm really enjoying it. Can't wait to get her on my podcast and talk to her as well. All right, last up, Zach to the Future. Mark Paul Gosselaar, a.k.a. Zach Morris, has not watched an episode of Saved by the Bell since he walked off the set over 25 years ago. Partnered with Dashiell Driscoll, who is currently writing for the series reboot and who wrote the Funny or Die series Zach Morris is Trash, which was hilarious. The duo revisits the show and recaps the most epic moments for the audience. Now, this, I gotta say, I was so excited about this. I actually put out a video before it came out, like, oh my god, this is gonna be huge. I'm one of the biggest Saved by the Bell fans on earth. And I thought this idea was great. Mark Paul Gosselaar with the guy who wrote Zach Morris's Trash and created those videos for YouTube. I thought it was a great concept. I thought it was a great idea, but I'll be at 100% honest here after listening to it. I've listened to every single episode, and I will all the way to the end. But I gotta say, Mark Paul is great. I'm not... Listen, it's no offense to Dashiell. He's a writer. He's a writer. He's not necessarily a broadcaster. He's not really necessarily a personality who, would be in front of the camera, in front of the microphone. And I don't know if they mesh that great. I don't know. And he seems like a great guy. But I'll be honest with you, I listened to this podcast for Mark Paul Gosselaar. There is another Saved by the Bell podcast. What's it called? Saved by the Bell. Oh my god, I can't believe I can't remember what it's called right now. Damn. I'm gonna write it in the description of this video. But it's my favorite Saved by the Bell podcast. And no actors from the show are in it or anything like that. That's one difference. Zach to the Future, it has interviews with past cast members from the show and stuff like that. It's really cool to hear, Mark Paul interact with his former co-stars. So that's pretty cool. But there's another podcast that came out a few years ago that I feel like is the definitive Saved by the Bell rewatch podcast. Anyway, Zach to the Future. It's the last one on my list, but it's definitely not the least. I like it. These aren't, like I said, they're in alphabetical order. So I like the podcast. I'm not absolutely in love with the interactions between Mark Paul and Dashiell. Maybe it's just the chemistry between them two. Like I said, I feel like Dashiell seems like a great guy. Seems like a cool guy. I just feel like the interaction between him and Mark Paul is not my favorite. Anyway, I hate being negative. I hate being negative. Hey, it's a great podcast, guys. Go listen to Zach to the Future. Because, I'm listening to every episode. So what the fuck am I talking about? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little breakdown. This very long breakdown that I'll probably break into several YouTube videos. I hope you enjoyed going through my podcast playlist. And I would love for you guys to give me some suggestions if you have any. As you can see, my playlist is pretty full. I've always got stuff to listen to, but I'm always willing to take on new podcasts. A lot of these ones that you've seen here are new additions, things that I've added over the past couple months. So I'm definitely open to new ideas. Send me your thoughts. Send me your podcast playlists. Put them in the description below, and I will check them out if they sound like something I'd be interested in. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. What I do on this channel is I try to put out stuff daily. It's not always like this, but it's usually pop culture, entertainment related. I do movie reviews, TV series reviews, current events. Every once in a while, I even talk about politics. Every once in a while, not often, but I just try to put out something daily. It's practice for me. It keeps me creative to think of things to put out each day, and I enjoy doing it. I enjoy putting stuff out every day. I love creating new things. So if that's something you're interested in, getting something new and interesting in your feed every day, maybe random things that different subjects that I like to talk about. If you're interested in that, please subscribe to the channel or favorite or follow the Daily BS podcast. And if you decide to stick around, if you decide to favorite or follow the podcast or subscribe here to the YouTube channel, then I will talk to you again tomorrow. Thanks.